On the 24th of October, 1716, Pope Clement XI and 8 cardinals visited the Maestre Pie. They were a group of unmarried laywomen teachers in Rome. No, this community was founded by Rosa Venetini, who you see holding her rule book open in front of the Pope. The Pope's celebrated visit was memorialized in this painting, and multiple accounts record him as saying that Venetini Schools were a blessing for Rome and the surrounding areas, and that they were doing more good for the city than even the seminaries of young men. One of Venetini's biographers, Andrea Girolamo Andreucci, similarly relays the visit, adding that the Pope wanted these schools in every diocese because he believed that communities that supplied medical doctors for the health of physical bodies should also provide for the welfare of souls. A study of Venetini schools makes clear that Clement XI was applauding post-Tridentine efforts to disseminate Christian doctrine among the lay population, teach women how to be good educators in the home, and implement rigorous moral discipline. The Pope was assuredly pleased that Venetini schools provided an alternative experience for the daughters of impoverished families who were often constrained to work in the fields alongside young men of loose morals. Indeed, Andreucci reports that Venetini schools had such an impact on society as to eliminate the practice of raucous bonfire parties in the countryside, where young men and improperly dressed young women spent the whole night dancing and singing. Similarly, Venetini's teachings put an end to the revelry at funeral gatherings where everyone enjoyed carousing around the casket. Venetini schools were so successful, in fact, that Father Antonio Baldinucci was often heard saying, "Basta una scuola pia per riformare un paese," which translates to, "It only takes one of these pious schools to reform a village." Because Venetini schools fostered such significant improvements in moral and social behavior, the top church hierarchy proposed that Venetini and later her assistant, Lucia Filippini, establish additional schools and hire more teachers throughout the small villages surrounding Lago Bolsena, a lake located about 100 kilometers from Rome. I think it's moving now. It's moving. Let's see. Yes, so
J'aime bien ça, c'est juste le fluide. Compétence.
Oh, here's something.
Oh, no,
It doesn't move the arrows.
Oh,
yes, it does. Good. Okay, good.
So is
okay.
it,
Yeah.
which
So this one. This, yes, this one. Okay, perfect. There's Rosa Venetini. Oh, you can't really see their names, huh? And Lucia Filippini.
But it's written on the...
Yes, you can see it. Yeah. In these first attempts to institute public education for women in Rome and the surrounding countryside, Venetini and Filippini were celebrated by some and derided by others. Yet today, even though many of their schools still exist across the world, not much is known about the pioneering efforts of these two educators. Approximately 40 years ago, in his fundamental study of primary education in Italy from the 16th to the 19th centuries, Guerrino Pelliccia made a brief mention of Venetini's and Filippini's schools. A year later, Sira Serenella Macchietti published a book on these first public institutions of learning for women in the Lazio region. My work expands on that of Pelliccia and Macchietti by drawing more extensively on the posizio of both Venetini and Filippini. These are large tomes of transcribed documents prepared by the Sacra Congregazione dei Riti, the Sacred Congregation of Rites, for the beatification proceedings of Venetini in 1943 and Filippini in 1923. My work also relies heavily on Andreucci's biography of Venetini, Francesco di Simone's biography of Filippini, and Pietro Bergamaschi's biography of the Cardinal Marcantonio Barbarigo, who encouraged and supported Filippini. Through a consideration of social and cultural details not mentioned in previous studies, my work argues for the importance of recognizing that devout lay women, such as tertiaries, or in Italian they call them pinzocchere, and these maestre pie, these teachers who often lived in all-female lay communities, were not anomalies in the early modern period, and that clergy supported and validated their cause. My article demonstrates that ecclesiastical leaders provided substantial support for Venetini's and Filippini's initiatives to establish public institutions of learning for women outside the convent, regardless of the difficulties these schools created by destabilizing social and religious norms and class and gender hierarchies. Venetini's and Filippini schools encountered aggressive opposition by townspeople because they challenged the societal notion that unmarried middle-aged women who were neither nuns nor tertiaries, nor under the direct authority of an enclosed convent or spouse, could live on their own and serve a vital role in the community, managing institutions of learning for girls and women of all classes in society. Furthermore, at least one clergy member expressed his disapproval when Venetini made frequent appearances to civic and religious leaders to ask for support and funding for her schools. And certain ecclesiastical leaders were quick to seek condemnation of Filippini's method of instruction on mental prayer. Notwithstanding these rebukes, Venetini and Filippini forged ahead, successfully instituting over 40 schools in the villages surrounding Lago Bolsena and experimenting with new and unusual pedagogical practices with the help of male leadership who recognized their unique capabilities. Where Venetini was supported by Ignazio Martinelli of the Jesuits, Filippini had the backing of Cardinal Marcantonio Barbarigo, the Bishop of Montefiascone and Corneto, and he was of the Padre Pii Operai. While this article points to some of the distinctions between the two religious orders, which influenced both women and ultimately may have led Venetini to break away from Filippini, my primary focus is to demonstrate that negotiation and collaboration took place between clergymen and these two women, which opened up possibilities for the acceptance of a female apostolate and a professional career for women as teachers and administrators who moved freely about the countryside to attend to their duties. Venetini's and Filippini schools are cases that prove that the 17th and 18th century church hierarchy sanctioned and promoted widespread education for women in self-determining institutions. I refer to the institutions that Venetini and Filippini founded as schools because that is what Clement XI and others at the time called them. Throughout the early modern period, institutions such as these were often called conservatories or congregations, but I believe that the specific references here to schools signals a change in the way that Venetini's and Filippini's institutions were uniquely viewed, not as mere shelters for unmarried girls, but as centers of spiritual and intellectual learning first and foremost, followed by training in the domestic arts, sewing and knitting and lace making. This education was intended to meet the post-Tridentine Church's objective of preparing women for their duties in the home or the convent. And yet these schools presented remarkable paid opportunities for lay women to provide significant work in their communities as pedagogues, recruiters, fundraisers, accountants, bookkeepers, artisans, advisors, spiritual leaders, custodians of girls, and social workers, even in the face of public criticism, disapproval by some religious leaders, and charges of apostasy by others. Venetini schools were among the first public schools in Italy for girls of all classes between the ages of 6 and 14. Supported by church funds, the schools offered an unconventional and free educational opportunity to girls whose only chance at formal education previously was in the convent as educande, and those are boarders. Venetini and her assistant Filippini, who later formed separate institutions and a distinct curriculum of her own, were not bound by solemn vows, nor were they required to follow traditional rules of enclosure. Thus, they were free to establish both day and boarding schools for girls in various villages and offer popular evening classes to adult women, in which they learned Christian doctrine and openly discussed solutions to social problems pertaining to women. While the public schools that Venetini and Filippini founded cannot be compared to those of today, they offered novel aspects that are still characteristic of modern public education. They had full-time instruction, breakfast and snacks. The girls went home for lunch at the end of the day if they were not boarders, and a comprehensive education providing instruction in practical, cultural, and spiritual matters in reading, writing, singing, simple math, household management, spinning, sewing, and lace making, in addition to religion. The schools were free of charge and widely promoted, and the curriculum was oriented toward a girl's future within her family and community. Furthermore, Venetini and Filippini sought to bridge the gap between public and private instruction by encouraging their day school students to return to their homes in the evening and share with their families what they were learning. Cardinal Barbarigo found that this type of informal instruction in the home, led by the girls themselves, was instrumental in dispelling pernicious habits that were building up in the community. He praised this unique way of training so many little domestic teachers, he called them. He said, tante maestrine domestiche, whose teaching in the home, he believed, had the capacity to solve many of the problems of an entire diocese. For centuries, convents served as the primary institutions of learning for girls who enrolled there as boarders under strict enclosure. But then in the late 1530s in Milan, there was another option for women's education, albeit on a smaller scale. Confraternities began offering general instruction to children in reading and writing on Sundays and holidays, with a focus on religious and moral issues. Priests and parents volunteered as their teachers. While they were called Scuole della Dottrina Cristiana, the schools of Christian doctrine, they were not schools per se, but rather simple meetings held in church buildings. They were supported by Pius IV, and the scuole made their way to Rome in 1560, where classes were taught on Sundays to numerous boys and girls in separate spaces. In these lessons, the children learned how to read and write from a 16-page primer called the Summario. Here it's the Sommario, a text that presented the alphabet, the sign of the cross, Latin prayers, the 10 commandments, 7 sacraments, 5 bodily senses, 4 cardinal virtues, and a number of precepts, hymns, and prayers. According to Christopher Carlsmith, who says, quote, the schools of Christian doctrine present an intriguing paradox. Driven and staffed by laymen and laywomen, yet engaged in training boys and girls in catechism and rudiments of faith. End quote. The Counter-Reformation Church was beginning to realize that literacy and the spread of Christian doctrine was not going to happen without the help of the lay community. In the early 17th century, church leadership enlarged the scope, the extent, and the duration of education for girls, especially for those of the lower classes who could not afford the dowry required of convents. Ecclesiastical leaders recognized the value of institutional education in a non-cloistered environment as a way to keep girls out of the fields, off the streets, and in a place where they would learn Christian doctrine and marketable skills that would help reform society. Since the confraternal schools only taught children on Sundays and holidays, ecclesiastical leaders promoted the formation of day and boarding schools, which they called collegi, scuole, or conservatori. And these institutions were not third-order monastic communities, and their teachers were not nuns or tertiaries. Because they focused on developing ethics and morals through literacy, as well as lavori femminili, which is women's work, they differed from those conservatories whose primary purpose was simply to house girls for safekeeping until they were married or joined the convent. These new schools, with the central focus on public women's education, were located throughout Italy. And these are the ones that I've been studying recently. The Collegio della Beata Vergine, founded in Cremona in 1610 by Lucia Perotti, with the assistance of the Jesuit priest Giovanni Melina. Il Conventino and La Quiete, established in Florence in 1628 and 1650, respectively, by Eleonora Ramirez di Montalvo, with the support of the Jesuit father Cosimo Pazzi. And this is an image of La Quiete that's behind. And the schools of the Maestre Pie, founded by Rosa Venerini, the first founded in Viterbo in 1685, and Lucia Filippini, with the backing of the Jesuits and the Padre Pio Operai. Another example of an institution of learning created only for girls outside of the convent was the Scuole Pontificie, the Pope Schools, founded by Girolamo Farnese in 1655 during Alessandro VII's papacy, which offered free tuition for students and a modest stipend from the Pope's steward for teachers. However, the Pope schools, where a holy fear of God and domestic arts were taught, focused for the most part on lavori femminili, with the primary objective that girls would learn some type of needlework to support their families, to supplement their family's income. Literacy was not an essential part of the curriculum in these institutions. According to Angela Groppi, schools for girls in Rome outnumbered schools for boys, but their emphasis was on needlework rather than on learning how to read. Teachers were required to be married, but they were not expected to know how to read. In fact, it was rare that reading was even taught. Of the 40 Scuole Pontificie, Felicia notes that only 2 in 1676 actually taught girls how to read. In 1695, there were only 5. In contrast to the Pope schools, the Scuole delle Maestre Pie, the ones I'm talking about today, founded by Venetini and Filippini, provided much more than a curriculum centered on lavori femminili. Their first aim was to teach girls how to read for the purpose of learning and understanding Bellarmino's Christian doctrine. The teachers often taught the girls while they were doing their lavori femminili, which Andreucci defined as knitting, sewing, and bobbin lace making. Secondarily, and for those students who were more capable, the teachers taught them how to write, but in a separate space so that they would not distract the others. Venetini's and Filippini schools also offered instruction in prayer, both vocal and mental, and taught their young charges how to recite the acts of faith, hope, and charity. According to the rule, the Maestre Pie were advised to teach the girls how to read good and holy books. And I have a list of those books that I'm not going to read the list, but if you're interested, I can tell you about them. One of Venetini's pupils, Maria Cecilia Bai, praised Venetini's methodology, reporting to her biographer that she herself, at 7 years of age, quote, said the office of the Madonna very well and read perfectly, end quote. Venetini and Filippini presented opportunities for women to work outside the home as maestre, as teachers, where they could make careers of teaching traditional subjects, Christian doctrine, the lives of the saints, as well as unconventional disciplines like history, geography, and basic arithmetic. Remarkably, the Maestre Pie also carried out important assignments previously conducted by men of the priesthood. These teachers delivered sermons, sometimes even in church, and they led others in the Ignatian spiritual exercises. And they called on families in a pastoral way to help them through their difficulties. Venetini's teachers were required to be single, without ties to a spouse or children, and without responsibilities in the home. 2 teachers were paid an annual salary, which was very poor, actually, but they did make some sort of a salary. And recognizing how meagerly the teachers were paid, Cardinal Barbarigo bought, rented, and renovated houses for Filippini schools and purchased a plot of land on which they could cultivate grain and harvest grapes to make wine. He also gave each school a certain amount of wine and oil every month, in addition to black twill for the teachers' clothes. Venetini's and Filippini's teachers would have been an unusual sight among communities of people who were accustomed to seeing adult women either in the convent or living under the protection of a spouse, parents, or relatives. One cardinal sought to clarify the uncommon nature of this kind of school, as he calls it, a secular place where the women, although residing in a pious institution, are still secular. The church formally recognized pious communities like those of Venetini and Filippini, where women did not take vows or observe enclosure, when in 1616 the Congregation of Bishops and Regulars listed them as congregations instead of convents. While the church sanctioned these schools and they filled a need in society, the Maestre Pie still faced much public opposition from those who were not willing to accept the fact that women teachers could live in places outside the jurisdiction of men and make independent decisions. Contemporaneous reports indicate that many thought Venetini's first school in Viterbo was full of bad omens. One of Venetini's biographers records that Venetini's assistant, Orzia Bacci, got so sick and had to return home, an event viewed by many as a sign that the school would certainly fail. Others believe that this incident proved that the school was full of tuberculosis. In another village, a crazy man shouted out to Venetini as she walked by, "If that school comes here, all hell will break loose." This man's statement seemed to presage what happened next. When Venetini's teachers first arrived in town late at night to set up their school, they found their accommodations were cold and they were given hardly any food. In the days to follow, the townspeople yelled and threw things at them as they walked through the streets. Someone shot a musket at them through the window of their house, and while the musket balls missed them, they hit and damaged a credenza in their lodging. Then someone set fire to the main entrance of their school, which filled with smoke. Finally, it was said that the devil himself pushed a servant down the stairs, severely injuring her head and neck. Andreucci believed it was, in fact, the devil who was trying to get the maestro to leave. In the communities of Viterbo and the surrounding regions, people were apprehensive about this new opportunity for women to reside in places where enclosure was not strictly enforced and where they had a measured amount of freedom outside of patriarchal control. The townspeople further complained that Venetini's and Filippini's female students were not learning how to perform the customary work required of them, that they were spending all their time in prayer, that the teachers admitted only those girls who had silk dresses, and that they allowed men inside their institutions late at night. When families stopped sending their girls to Filippini schools so they could work instead in the fields to supplement their family's income, Cardinal Barbarigo sought to draw them back by supplying each school with a substantial amount of hemp fiber that the girls could spin while listening to their lessons, thus learning important moral and religious principles while earning money toward their dowries. In an attempt to persuade villagers of the importance of educating women, ecclesiastical leaders also intervened in other ways. Cardinal Urbano Sacchetti, the Bishop of Viterbo, explained to the local priests that women have the right to receive more education than what was available to them through the standard catechism classes offered on Sundays. Sacchetti quoted to them from Acts 2:18, "Upon my servants indeed, and upon my handmaids will I pour out in those days of my spirit, and they shall prophesy." And he wanted to teach the local congregations that the Lord's Spirit is felt through instruction imparted not only to men, but also to women. Alessandro Mazzinelli, the rector of Cardinal Barbarigo's seminary in Montefiascone, also sought to define and justify this new type of school. In his instructions for the schools of Christian doctrine, a 1717 revision of the rule Cardinal Barbarigo established for the teachers of Filippini schools, Mazzinelli stated that the maestre pie practiced a third way of life, offsetting the two customary options of wife and nun, that unites the duties of the religious life with the work of a secular life. And Mazzinelli explained that these schools were noteworthy because they assumed a type of life where, without being confined to the cloister or absorbed in the world, they enjoy the privileges of both these positions without experiencing any of the disadvantages. According to Mazzinelli, the maestre pie were returning to a way of living that early Christian women enjoyed. And this is the quote from his instruction: neither is this way of life new, since it is the same that the Christian virgins led in the first centuries of the church, when monasteries or cloisters did not yet exist. The chaste spouses of the Lord lived in the midst of the world, and the unique virtue and respect reflected in their demeanor served as a defense of their innocence, dividing their time in a holy manner between contemplation, the worship of God, and the assistance they lent to their neighbor. They were not idle in seclusion, nor consumed by their charitable duties. Mazzinelli, and possibly Barbarigo as the original author of this text, believed that the maestre pie were restoring an ideal way of existence, thus finding middle ground between the active and the contemplative lives. With the support of spiritual directors who recognized that female leadership could have a transformative influence on society, Venetini and Filippini schools endured social criticism and even a split in leadership. Venetini and Filippini parted ways not just to divide and conquer, but also because of fundamental differences in pedagogical methods due to the leadership of separate religious orders. Filippini served as Venetini's assistant in Viterbo and the surrounding areas until Cardinal Barbarigo asked her to take over the school Venetini had founded in Montefiascone. The cardinal called Filippini schools the apple of his eye and financially supported any girl who wanted to matriculate. Filippini's biographer Andreucci recalls an experience when the girls of one of Filipini's schools were returning from mass and encountered a group of boys playing bocce. One of the boys, the son of the governor, approached one of Filipini's girls and cleaned his muddy bocce on her apron. When the cardinal found out about this, he threw the boy in jail for a time and then sent him and his father to live elsewhere. Barbarigo and Martinelli supported Filippini's and Venetini's fundamental differences in pedagogy and even in the governing of their schools. Barbarigo declared that Filippini, as the treasurer, was to have full control over the financial dealings of her institutions, and he provided her with vouchers to give to the baker, merchants, and shopkeepers in exchange for necessary goods. Concerning Venetini's many duties interacting with local authorities, bishops, parish priests, and benefactors, it was believed that Martinelli served only as an advisor, and he did not intervene. This is what Martinelli, or one of the biographers, reports. Among other things, as a wise person, Martinelli was careful not to overshadow the foundress and to give her accordingly the necessary freedom. Thus, it was Venetini who presented requests and petitions to the municipal offices for the acceptance of teachers and the requisite funding. It was Venetini who also interacted with bishops and prelates. And it was Venetini who, having heard Martinelli's view, made the final decisions for her girls. In a word, it was Father Martinelli who advised, directed, and supported the foundress, but without just diminishing any of her authority with regard to her dear girls. End of quote. In fact, when Martinelli was transferred to Loreto, Venetini was left entirely in charge of the school in Viterbo. Both Marangoni and Andreucci point out that Venetini appeared energized during the period in which Martinelli was gone, and she went about visiting bishops of the surrounding dioceses to see if they would open other schools based on the model of her Viterbo school. Venetini's new spiritual director, however, considered this type of active proselyting a temptation and tried to discourage her from doing it. Venetini made frequent appearances at the municipal offices to ask for public funds so that her schools would not be obligated to charge tuition. In Soriano, for example, in 1707, Venetini made a request to the governor in her role as the foundress of the Scuole Pie on behalf of the feminine sex. The governor wrote an appeal to his cabinet stating that the funds would be a little reward considering the efforts these maestre make in educating girls. 2 years later, the Maestre Pie of Soriano received 4 scudi a year for their lodging. It is highly probable that Venetini's initiative served as an example for the Maestre Pie of another city who made a similar petition to the Consiglio del Comune in 1723 to request funding, and they subsequently received 20 scudi a year. It turns out that Filippini's methods were more popular with the girls than were Venetini's. According to Cardinal Barbarigo's biographer, Filippini's charisma attracted many followers as she went around town with a cross and a companion who rang a bell to encourage girls to come to her school. One of Filippini's biographers, Francesco di Simone, relates that one of her first students in Rome, who later became a Maestra Pia, made the following statement about Filippini. Quote, "I had such a desire to be with her that I cried so that my relatives would let me stay with her. She seemed like a saint to me, and I liked the training at the school so much and the prayers that she gave that I was crazy about all of it. For that reason, I never missed going to school, and also some nights I was very happy to stay there to sleep." End of quote. Di Simone gives examples of Filippini's well-received practice of heroic asceticism, which included girls begging to lie on the ground and kiss the feet of those who trampled over them. Other types of self-punishment included girls willingly offering their faces to be slapped or publicly asking for forgiveness and making crosses on the floor with their tongues. Cardinal Barbarigo's biographer writes that Filippini encouraged the girls to make heavy wooden crosses to drag around for penance, to climb the stairs on their bare knees, simulating the devotion of pilgrims at the Holy Stairway, to eat disgusting food or lick the wounds or vomit of others, and to let Filippini cut off their eyelashes. These acts of self-mortification would not have been permitted in a Jesuit congregation, of which Venetini was a part, as her schools were under the jurisdiction of Father Ignazio Martinelli of the Jesuits. Filippini's emphasis on self-mortification may have been guided by her own natural inclination, but also seems to have been driven by the spiritual orientation of the Padre Pii Operai, distinct from that of the Jesuits in practicing a strict rule, austere spirit, exuberant zeal, firm piety, but with outward expressions similar to the Southern way and with a shade of Spanish rigor. Moreover, Filippini's teaching and practice of self-mortification and mental prayer were directly aligned with the methods of the Padre Pii Operai, many of whom were examined for heretical tendencies by church authorities. In 1707, when Filippini spent a few months in Rome to establish another school, she too was suspected of following the principles of the heretical movement, Quietism, especially in the manner of leading others in mental prayer. She decided to return to Montefiascone and asked Venetini to take her place as the director at the school in Rome. To avoid upsetting the girls, Filippini left the school in secret late one night, and when the girls woke up the next morning, they discovered that Venetini was their new superior. Biographers report that Venetini insisted on changing the way Filippini was doing things. The girls did not like Venetini's methods and began to leave the school. After only 3 months, the Pope's almoner suggested that Venetini return to Viterbo and Filippini to Rome. At first, when I was doing research on this, I thought that they probably the girls would have preferred Venetini over Filippini, but it was surprising to me that they preferred the more austere methods, and they liked actually that way of life a lot better. Filippini's emphasis on extreme self-mortification and mental prayer led to accusations of heresy, notwithstanding the support she received from Cardinal Barbarigo and Bishop Tommaso Falcoia. After the first denunciation in 1707, Filippini was again accused in 1711 in Todi for the newness of her mental exercises. Finally, in 1719, she was examined for practices in her schools that were similar to Quietism, Jansenism, and Molinism. Molinos published his Guia Espiritual in Rome in 1675. However, in the end, Filippini was not found guilty. The vicar testified on 6th of July, 1719, that he observed Filippini and a teacher, Santa, in Scansano, performing mental prayer with women in one room and men and priests in the other. And for 8 hours a day, for the 8 days the authorities were there examining their case, the only unusual thing that happened during that time was that some women fainted. And the vicar thought it was because it was too hot and there were too many women in the room. Filippini's and Venetini schools still exist and thrive today in Italy and various parts of the world. These are where Filippini schools are. And these are where Venetini's, yeah. But there is one important change. In 1941, Venetini's Maestre Pie accepted binding vows and convent rules. By contrast, Filippini's followers take pride in the fact that they are not nuns, but remain to this day pious laywomen who have chosen their vocation without constraint and who make conscious efforts to rededicate themselves daily to their work. Because they are not bound by monastic rules and are free to leave the congregation at any time, their commitment, as one of the Maestre Filippini in Montefiascone told me, is perhaps stronger and more devoted to their founders' aims. So when I was at the congregation in Montefiascone, I spoke to one of these women, and she is the one that told me that that she's very proud that she's not a nun, that she makes this commitment in her heart every day, she said. Both Lucia Filippini and Rosa Venetini have been canonized. Filippini in 1930 and Venetini in 2006. But it's the more radical leader, Filippini, who has been recognized with the highest of public honors by the Catholic Church. In the south nave of St. Peter's Basilica stands a 13-foot marble statue of Filippini with the young female student at her side in one of the upper recesses on the right, designed by the artist Silvio Silva. This rendition of Filippini is one of only 39 statues, 10 of which are women, placed between the mid-18th century and the mid-20th century, in the niches of the nave, apse, and transepts. These statues, depicting Saints Benedict, Francis, Dominic, Angela Merici and Teresa di Gesù, for example, represent the most important founders of religious orders and congregations of the Catholic Church since the Middle Ages. Although the last of these sculptures was put in place in 1954, well before Venetini was even declared a saint, Filippini's statue remains as a distinguished reminder that the early modern church sanctioned and promoted unconventional educational practices with women at the helm. 20 years ago, Gabriella Zari called attention to the widespread prevalence in early modern society of the third state, she calls it the terzo stato, whereby those who did not marry or enter the convent adopted a life of prayer and community service while residing in their homes or in all-female communities. Zari argued convincingly that this third position was a recurrent option in early modern Italy, and yet many scholars have continued to view the presence of devout lay women, especially those who resided in all-female communities, as a rare departure from the two primary vocational options of wife and nun. Because scholarship of the past 30 years has prioritized all-female communities that capitulated to pressure from church authorities to renounce their lay status, historians have perpetuated the notion of a commanding patriarchal rule that prohibited those institutions from surviving independently as their founders wished. While some semi-autonomous groups of women were eventually constrained to a cloistered existence, the current tendency to claim that the church was reluctant to permit such lifestyle arrangements has tainted our view, leaving us with the impression that there is no room for exception and innovation. By concentrating our efforts on the recovery of documents that illuminate the powerful leadership role that early modern women assumed in public institutions of learning, I believe that we will discover greater collaboration between ecclesiastical leaders and women, and more important responsibilities for women than were previously thought.